Hello, global gardeners. Welcome to another edition of your gardening week on a gardening Monday. Great to see everybody here checking in from all over the world. Jen Page in Ontario is checked in, expecting a frost soon. I actually had a hard freeze in my garden this last week. In recent weeks, we've been talking about how to protect your plants, putting hoops and covers over them to gain a few extra degrees. But as is typical here in Colorado, we don't go easily into autumn. And so we went from very warm conditions to very cold conditions overnight, had a hard freeze before we really had our first frost. And so it got down to about 25 degrees Fahrenheit, about -3 Celsius, which even with some hoops and plastic is not enough to protect some of those tender plants. So while I'm still growing my beets and my kale and my chard, the plants that can handle cold, my tomatoes and peppers and squashes and melons are done for the season. So I'm in cleanup mode, and I know a few of you are in cleanup mode as well. Today I want to focus on fertilizers and what that means in your garden and how to use fertilizers in your garden, because there are just so many misconceptions about fertilizers and how or if we're even supposed to use them. So let's go ahead and start with a question from Brian. And it's a good one, and it ties in very closely with what I want to talk about today. Two-part question. Can I completely cut my comfrey to the ground, and will a final blast of comfrey tea be beneficial to my amended beds? And so comfrey, if you're not aware, is a wonderful plant. It's a very leafy plant, and in the world of permaculture, it's called a nutrient accumulator. In other words, it's got great roots that go down into the ground and bring up all those nutrients from deep into the soil, up into the plant, and into the leaves. And so the leaves themselves are packed with nutrients, about 15 or so nutrients, to include nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium and copper and magnesium. Just, it's a wonderful plant to grow. And so what you can do is take those leaves and steep them in water for a few weeks and get a tea that will have those nutrients within the water. And I have an older video where I show how to make comfrey tea. And when I use fertilizer, and we'll get to more about this throughout the next hour or so, I like to use a natural product that I can make myself because I know what's in it. And I grow comfrey for that reason, because the comfrey tea has all of those macro and micronutrients that I can add to my plants. So to answer Brian's first question, can you cut it to the ground? Yeah, that's one of the great things about comfrey, is you can cut it back about 3 times a year and get a full harvest of these big, beautiful leaves to either use as a mulch, which is what I like to do with the leaves, or add to your compost pile and give it a boost of nutrients, which I also like to do, or make a tea with it and fertilize your plants with that tea. And so it tends to slow down a little bit. It will wilt in the summer, but it starts real early in the spring growing. It can handle cold conditions. It's a perennial. So I'll cut back the leaves pretty much to the ground. I won't cut the new growth, the young growth, in spring. And then I'll get another harvest in late summer. And typically at this time of year for me, going into autumn, before the leaves freeze, I can actually get a third harvest of those leaves. So by all means, go ahead and cut back a plant. But to the point about fertilization. And so I note in the question, is it beneficial to the amended beds, as opposed to, will it be beneficial for my plants? And so I like the way the question is phrased, because that's one of the biggest issues about fertilization. Is so often we think we have to fertilize our plants, and our plants need that extra nutrition, and that's how fertilizer is marketed and sold to all of us gardeners, is you buy this liquid and pour it on your plants and your plants will do better. I think it's more important that we feed the soil. And so particularly using something like Comfrey tea that has all of these different nutrients in a soluble form, putting it into the soil can actually be beneficial for the plants. We're not feeding the plants, we're feeding the soil, and we're adding back some of the elements, the elemental nutrients that our plants will need that the soil might not have. And so a plant like Comfrey can mine those nutrients from deeper in the ground and bring them up to the leaves, and the soil in our beds might not have those same nutrients. So 2 newly amended beds, I think using a fertilizer like Comfrey tea can be a really good idea, because you're adding some of the nitrogen that the microorganisms are going to need to break down the organic matter that you're using in your amended beds, and you're adding additional nutrients to the soil that your plants will be able to use later on. As a fertilizer for plants, this is where it starts getting a little sticky, and this is why I wanted to talk about it today. You can use fertilizers from start to finish in the growing season on your plants, and your plants will probably do pretty well. But if you're not thinking about your soil, when you stop using fertilizers, your plants are going to suffer. It's like you go to a carnival and you eat popcorn and chili dogs and cotton candy all day long, and it's going to give you a ton of energy, especially if you give your kids cotton candy all day long. They're going to be bouncing off the walls. But then when you stop all of that simple carbohydrate diet, everybody crashes. And that's kind of what happens with your plants. If you're doing a fertilizer feeding on a regular basis, your plants are happy, they're rocking, they're growing, they're just doing wonderfully. And then when you stop the fertilizer, well, there's nothing left to support the plant because you haven't focused on your soil. And so it becomes one of these addictive activities for your plants where you have to keep giving them fertilizer for them to grow, because the soil does not have enough nutrition to supply the plants. So we'll talk more about the soil, more about the plants as we continue. But let's go ahead and see what else is popping out there. Jen Page has been really active today. I think that's wonderful. So glad to see you going back and forth. Bobby Wilson is saying hello. Linda Hardwick is saying that bought some Russian comfrey from a website. I don't see the website popping up, but I'm guessing it'll pop up soon. Charlie's saying hello from Kentucky. River and Dale are here with us today. So nice to see so many regulars and some new people popping up. And so any questions you have, I want to talk about fertilizer, but any other questions you have, by all means, throw them out, because we have the great moderators with us today, Jay and Heidi, and they can answer your questions. And there's also so many others that are so knowledgeable with their gardening information that'll help you out as well. Heidi's saying, because I have 2-foot high raised beds, I do use an organic fish-based organic fertilizer so I can feed the soil microbes. Also, nutrients can get washed out of my high beds. And this is exactly to my point, Heidi, and thanks for bringing this up. I also use fish emulsion in addition to the Comfrey tea that I was talking about. I use kelp as well, and I'm feeding my soil. I'm putting all of that on the beds, particularly the raised beds, because you're right, it can leach out. But it's for the soil organisms. And so all of those nutrients and that organic matter that might be in a fish emulsion fertilizer, it helps the soil microorganisms. It's food for them. There are so many fertilizers that we use that really can't be used by the plants unless we have those soil microorganisms. So this is the first part of this discussion where I want to break down how fertilizers work and the different types of fertilizers. So there's the slow release fertilizers, and then there's the quick release fertilizers, the quick response fertilizers. And so most of what we tend to be familiar with is like Miracle Grow. You take that blue powder, you mix it with water, and you put that on your plants as a fertilizer. And that's how Miracle Grow markets it. Feed your plants. That's a water-soluble, quick-release fertilizer. There are many organic fertilizers, mostly, that tend to be slow release. And those typically come in little pellets, and you put those around your plants, and over time, they dissolve and add nutrients to the soil. Well, here's how it basically works when we talk fertilizers. Nitrogen, as you probably know, is needed for plants to grow well. Well, nitrogen, we can add a ton of nitrogen to the soil, and if there's no soil life in that soil, the nitrogen is not available for the plant. And so a poor, dead soil loaded with nitrogen will lead to poor, dead plants because the soil microbes convert that nitrogen into a form that the plants can use. And that's typically ammonium. It's the ammonium that the plants are using. Well, if you look at the ingredients on a package of like Miracle Grow quick release water soluble fertilizer, you'll see that ammonium is what it's using. So that means as soon as you mix it with water and pour it on the plants, it's in a form that can be used by the plants right away. That's why those fertilizers work, because they don't require the soil microbes. It's in a form that the roots can suck up and help grow the plant. A slow release fertilizer that is nitrogen based and typically pelletized needs to be broken down by soil organisms into that ammonium for the plants to use. And that's why it's slow release, because that takes time to happen. So those are the two basic categories of fertilization and why farmers use chemicals on their crops in their dead soil, because kind of like the cotton candy analogy, you have to keep doing that because the organisms in the soil are gone. They're dead. They have no food to eat because there's a symbiotic relationship between the plants and the soil. And so the plants are doing photosynthesis for themselves, but they're also giving some of their energy, some of the carbohydrates and starches through their roots into the soil to feed the microorganisms that then break down the organic matter in the soil to give back to the plant. Well, if you break that cycle, and these chemical fertilizers are enough to often kill the soil life in the soil, they break the cycle. And so now the fertilizer has to be in a form that the plants can use directly. And when you stop using those fertilizers, then the plants stop growing. And so it becomes this vicious, endless cycle that we as home gardeners don't have to follow. And that's where we'll get to talking about amending and some of the things we can do for our soil here in just a little bit. Patrick, good morning to you. Thank you so much for that super chat. Will the scented additive in kitty litter inhibit seed germination in seed bombs? Good question. And so if I just did a video a few days ago about making seed bombs, and I talk about using clay to mix with compost, and that you can use kitty litter as the clay component. And I actually did film a brief portion where I talked about this, Pat, but I didn't include it in the final cut of the video. I would suggest staying away from scented kitty litter. But from what I could tell, and I really couldn't find much of anything, there's no mention of what the scent is that's in kitty litter. And so I have to assume that it's not harmful for plants, but I don't know. And that's why I would advise to just stay away from it. So I don't think it would inhibit seed germination because seeds have everything they need to germinate. What it could do is kind of what we're talking about right now. There could be something in that chemical that's being used for a fragrance in kitty litter that might affect the soil bacteria and might be harmful for them, but honestly don't know. I could not find any good information on it, which is why I didn't include it in the video. But that is a good question, and the kitty litter I got has no fragrance in it, so it was good to make the seed balls without any issue. So that was a fun video to make, and I didn't realize how many people had not heard of seed bombs or even the concept of seed balls. So I'm glad I made that video. I've been doing seed bombs for years and years and years. I have on my web page, which I don't keep up with, but I did a blog for a number of years, and about probably 10 years ago, I did a blog entry on making seed bombs. That also has a lot of information, and I talk about how doing it can be a fun project for the family, especially kids. I'm gonna have my granddaughters out this week, and we're gonna do kind of a reverse Easter egg hunt. So on Easter, you hide the eggs and then go find them. Well, I'm going to give them some of the seed bombs and do it in reverse and say, go hide these seed bombs in the garden, and wherever they hide them, that's hopefully where new plants are going to grow. So I think that'll be a fun activity for them. And there's a link that Jay has given. Thanks so much for that, Jay. Always staying on top of things. That's nice. Yeah, and Jen says, never heard of seed bombs before in the video. This is one of those things, and maybe it's because I'm an old gardener and been gardening for decades, but in the 1970s, when the green guerrillas were active in New York and throwing the seed bombs throughout the vacant lots and growing flowers all throughout the city area, it was big news in the gardening community. And so that's kind of when I was first exposed to it. And then over the years, I encountered from time to time. I'll be doing another video inspired by my sister-in-law that actually talks about being a guerrilla gardener and how to get a group together and go out and use the seed bombs as a group activity. And so in her church earlier this year, a group of them got together and made seed bombs and went out to some land that someone had offered up for this purpose, and they spread their seed bombs to grow wildflower seeds. And so it is a good idea to get the permission of the landowner ahead of time so that you're not inadvertently spreading plants that somebody doesn't want. But I'll be showing that in a future video. She filmed some of their activities, walking out in this field and tossing their seed bombs for additional plants. So if you haven't heard of seed bombs, check out that video, because it does have an interesting history, and they're extremely easy to make. Hello, Kevin. Guerrilla gardening. Yeah, lots of people did it in the 70s with marijuana seeds. I've never lived in an area where marijuana could grow actively outdoors without some serious cultivation, but yeah, I don't doubt that at all. And so, yes, so it's not gorillas with an O-R, it's gorillas with a U-E-R, as Kevin spelled it out. And it is one of those kind of things that is kind of fun to get people involved with seeds and an innovative way to spread them. Hi, Jay. I'm on the edge of various edgy groups. When I lived in the city, seed bombs were part of the guerrilla gardener movement. Awesome, yeah. And it's still being done. I just think it's one of those things that it doesn't make the news anymore like it did back then. So you can actually, in fact, this is what my sister-in-law did. You can buy bags of seed bomb mix, or like I show in my video, it's basically just mixing compost and clay together and then putting your seeds in it, and it works out pretty well. Mayday Garden, hello to you, is asking, can I use worm leachate to amend my soil along with worm compost and chopped plants pulled from the summer harvest? Yes, but, and so if you're doing vermicomposting and you have a worm bin system set up where it drains through the bins, and then you have the leachate, the liquid that has gone through the worm castings and all the other material embedding in your bed, you can use that leachate in your garden. Now, there are some concerns I have about it. Typically, the bacteria that are in that leachate are anaerobic bacteria. That's why it so often smells bad. So I would advise aerating it, leaving it outside for a day or two for those anaerobic bacteria to start dying off, because the bacteria that are in our soil, the beneficial bacteria for our plants, are aerobic bacteria. A good soil actually has about 25% air in it. There's lots of pockets of air within our soil. And so the plants need those pockets of air, and the microbes need those pockets of air. And so if you introduce a liquid filled with anaerobic bacteria, at least in the short term, that liquid is going to kill off the aerobic bacteria, and the anaerobic bacteria will have a brief existence in your soil, and it's going to throw everything off balance. So yes, you can use the leachate, but I would put it in the compost pile as an option, or like I said, try to aerate it before you put it into your beds. But mixing it with the plants, mixing it with worm castings is definitely an option, because there will be some nutrients in that liquid that have leached or that have gone through the castings, and the castings have leached those nutrients into that liquid. So definitely an option. The way I do my bins is to avoid getting that really wet condition. And so my bins don't smell, and I don't have that leachate of the worm bins to use in my beds, but it's definitely something you can give a try to. Okay, Urban Chicken Mama, hello. Made my hoop houses this weekend and started removing all the dying plants. First year using them. Any tips? And so just keep doing it. And so the thing about hoop houses is to get used to the temperature differences, so you can understand just how much of a temperature gain you get in a hoop house versus the outside air. And so what I've done in the past is to get wireless thermometers, and you can get some where you have like two sensors. So you have one that you put outside, then you have one that you'll put inside, and typically the second one will have the temperature reading for both the first and the second sensor. And so that's one tip, and I'm going to be doing that with my greenhouse this year, where you have readings of what the temperature is outside the hoop house, and you have a temperature reading of what's inside the hoop house. And that'll give you a really good idea of just how much protection you're actually getting for your plants. So that as you move forward, you can plan accordingly. Like I started with, 25 degrees Fahrenheit for me is too cold for my hoop protection. And so when I see temperatures like that coming, I don't even make an effort to cover my plants, because I know, based on that experience and the measurements of the temperatures that I've taken, just how much I gain and whether it's worth the effort or not. And so that would be the first thing to think about. And then start thinking about your planning as you move forward, because when you have an idea of how much extra protection you get from a temperature perspective, and also measure the soil temperature in addition to this, whenever you want to venture into something new, measure the soil temperature inside and outside as well, because that's a real good idea of how you can extend your season late and also start early. And so start thinking from a planning perspective that you're probably going to be able to get 3, 4, maybe even up to 6 weeks early start in a hoop house, because you have that extra heat and because the soil is warming faster. So going into spring, start measuring your soil temperature in the hoop house. And when you see it start to warm up, you can start putting in some of those cool season plants like the spinach and the broccoli and the chard and the beets and all those kind of things. So at this point, I would say the tip is just to start becoming familiar with it, and to get yourself a little more experience with how it affects the soil, because a hoop house can really keep the soil warm later in the season. And so like right now, my season's over. But if I had a really good hoop house system with some additional protection, I might still be able to grow some things in the hoop house that I wouldn't be able to grow outside the greenhouse. So hope that helps a little bit. Hello, Tug says, this season my sweet corn grew large ears on the upper part of the stalk, but the bottom ears would not grow more than 3 inches long. What's your thoughts? It could be the spacing of the plants. It could be that they were a little close together, and so the bottom of the plant might not have gotten the fertilization. Corn is wind pollinated, and so you have to get the pollen falling from the tassels down onto the ears. And if you don't have complete fertilization, the ears aren't going to grow completely. It could be a watering issue because the plants typically are going to put most of the energy to the new growth and the top of the plant, and that will be at the expense of the lower leaves and lower fruit. And so if the soil got particularly dry, or if it was really hot conditions, the top of the plant might actually grow a little bit better than the bottom of the plant. It could be shading. So those are probably a couple factors, but as long as the upper plant was good and you had really good ears, I'd consider that a success. Maybe space them a little farther apart next time and see if maybe that makes a little bit of a difference. So, okay, let's get back to the fertilizer a little bit and talk some more about some thoughts along those lines. And so the picture behind me today is my garden. This is actually from this last year. And I wanted to show this because none of these beds were fertilized. And I think you would agree with me, this is a right after sunrise. And so these leaves are really not yellowed leaves. That's just the sunlight that's just creeping over the horizon on those leaves. You can see that the leaves are actually quite dark green, and all these pumpkins back here dark green. The green beans on this trellis are dark green. All these squashes are nice dark green. The plants do great in my beds, and I don't fertilize because I focus on the soil. So I do fall amending and or spring amending. So all of these beds were amended the previous autumn with a lot of organic matter mixed into the soil. The beds were mulched over the winter. And then in spring, I started all of these plants from seed and mulched through the season, kept the soil moist. And I didn't need fertilizer because the soil was healthy enough. The soil had all that organic matter that the microorganisms could break down and make usable for the plant. So if you do that, if you have healthy soil, as you can see behind me, you don't need fertilizer. It's as simple as that. Now, I do use fertilizer occasionally in those areas where I have not had the time to amend the beds well, and where I know the nutrient levels might be low for some of the plants that might be in that bed. Like we were talking about with the fish emulsion and the Comfrey, I fertilize my soil. And so some of the brand new beds that I have just completed this year, part of my fall preparation will be to put a slow release fertilizer on those beds now or in the next couple weeks. I have cover crops on many of those beds, and so they'll rest all winter long. In spring, that slow release fertilizer will have added nutrients to the soil. The cover crops will have added nutrients to the soil. And then in the spring, I can do like this, where I put seeds in and the soil is ready to go. So as a shortcut in new beds, I'll add slow release fertilizers just to help jumpstart the soil life, because those soil microbes need some of that nitrogen as they're conducting their beneficial activities, eating up all of that organic matter that's in the soil. So don't think it has to be all or nothing. You can use fertilizer if it's necessary. If you're growing plants in a bed and they're not doing well during the growing season, and you stop and try to figure out what's going wrong, and you realize that you didn't amend the soil, either in the spring or the previous fall, it could be a nutrient issue. The plants just aren't being fed with the nutrients they need. that's when the quick release water soluble fertilizers come into play. It's okay to use that to keep your plants going if you didn't take the time to improve your soil. So I'm always talking about soil. I'm always suggesting that you amend your soil. I'm always saying do this in the fall. I'm saying get a head start on it, but I know that that doesn't always happen. And so it's okay to use fertilizer. Just recognize that in that situation, that's when you want to use a product where it's immediately available for the plants. You wouldn't want to do a slow release fertilizer mid-season when the plants are suffering, because the plants just aren't going to have the nutrients fast enough to do any good. You also don't want to add the fertilizers late in the season. And so like right now, we're talking about protecting the plants and trying to extend the season a little bit and these frosts that are coming. Well, if you've fertilized late in the growing season, you've probably given that plant a quick boost, a boost of new growth. And so when plants get that boost of fertilizer, primarily nitrogen, they start growing more leaves, more shoots, more stems, and they take away their focus on the fruit and flower production. And so a late fertilization can actually be one of the worst things you can do going into autumn, because now the plant is getting all this new growth. Well, you want to harvest. Then when a freeze comes or a hard frost, that new growth is going to be killed off, and you still don't have the flowers and the fruit that you were hoping to get. So if you use fertilizer, it tends to be an early season additive to your soil, ideally, to get the plant growing well and to get it established. That's how I approach it. That's why I'm doing a slow release fertilizer in fall, so that those plants will have a boost in spring. And then I won't fertilize after that point, because I want the plant to get that development within the good soil that I have given to them. But if you haven't, again, done the soil, you might need a mid-season fertilizer as it starts getting into the flower and fruit production, just so you have a good, robust plant. But at that point, you want to cut back on the nitrogen component of the fertilizer and start focusing on the phosphorus and potassium component. So you'll often see this with a fertilizer, like a 10-10-10 is what we call a balanced fertilizer. It has 10% nitrogen, 10% phosphorus, 10% potassium. You'll often see tomato fertilizers that are intended to do in mid-season. And that first number, the nitrogen, will be the smallest number. So you might see a tomato fertilizer that is an 8, 15, 14, with those two numbers, the phosphorus and the potassium, higher, because those are the nutrients that are going to give you a strong plant and, more importantly, give you the flower development and the fruit development. So as you choose your fertilizers, you have to be aware of what these different things are doing. The nitrogen is giving you the nice green growth of the plant. And the more nitrogen, the more green growth you're going to get. If you have a plant like a tomato or a pepper and you're not getting any fruit, but you're getting a big, bushy, beautiful plant, it's probably because the plant has too much nitrogen. So it just keeps growing and growing. The phosphorus, that middle number, that's the one that you really want to start looking for to get that flower and fruit development. And the potassium tends to give you the root focus, but it's really more designed to, it's kind of like the crossing guard. It makes sure everything works together in order, and it's needed as a macronutrient. But it's not as important as nitrogen for the initial growth of the plant, and it's not as important as the phosphorus for the flower and fruit development. So that's the basics of fertilizer. And if you choose to use it, try to make sure that you're choosing the right kind, which is why the companies market it with the name. and they'll tell you that it's a tomato fertilizer or that it's a flower fertilizer, and that's how they market it, because the mix will be focused on those particular parts of the plant. So hopefully that helps a little bit. Let's see what else we have popping up here. Nina's asking, anyone watch Wisconsin Gardeners? Richard and wife, I think her name is Lynn. I do watch some of the Wisconsin Gardeners videos. They've got some good stuff out there. It's not a channel I regularly watch, but I'll give a shout out to them because I do think they've got some good stuff. So thanks for bringing that up. It's always nice to give a shout out to other channels, and I'll be talking about that in the philosophy part as we move forward. And Mary Playford says they're friends. That's great. This is such a great, it just goes to show that gardeners are a wonderful community, and we all know each other one way or another, whether we realize it or not. Okay, let's see. David Rabacho is saying, I'm a blind gardener, and is there a way to tell when your squash plants have powdery mildew besides seeing it? I missed it, and all my plants died from the bottom up. There is a texture difference, David, but it's one of those things that you'll have to feel it to be able to know which is which. And so, powdery mildew is a fungus that grows on the plant, and so, as you might guess from mold, which was also a fungus, it has kind of that feel to it. So it kind of has a soft, powdery, moldy kind of feel if you touch the leaves. Whereas a leaf without powdery mildew, you should be able to feel the texture of the leaf, and it should be quite noticeable. So I would suggest just trying to get out in the garden and feel the difference between a healthy plant and a plant that's been infected. One of the things, I had a few questions about powdery mildew this week, and one of the best ways to combat it is in planting and pruning your plants. Air circulation will greatly reduce the likelihood of powdery mildew. It's when plants are grouped really close together and the air becomes stagnant that the powdery mildew really tends to take over. So as you look to the future, just try to give your plants plenty of space. And if they're growing close together, prune off some of those branches, to include squashes. You can prune off squash branches, especially those lower branches that are starting to fade anyway, and that can help out. I saw some activity early in the discussion about some powdery mildew issues. Because it's a fungus, some of the things that you might think work in your garden to keep pests away, like garlic sprays, really aren't going to have any effect whatsoever. You really need to be looking at antifungal sprays. And so copper sprays actually can work on powdery mildew. We've talked recently about using milk, and using milk mixed with water. A diluted milk solution has been shown to have some antifungal properties. Cinnamon has antifungal properties. So there are things that you can put on the leaves to reduce the growth of the powdery mildew. But for the most part, once it's there, you're just kind of trying to control it. And in many cases, it's a losing battle because the spores are already in place. You have to act as soon as you detect it on your plants with something like an antifungal spray to hope to combat it and let your plants grow. But I hope that helps, David. There is a difference in the feel, and that might be one of those things that you can figure out. Lila says, are the straw bales that are being sold for Halloween decorations okay to use in the garden, or does that have seeds? I'm a little confused about hay versus straw. Okay, let's talk about hay versus straw. And so they are two different things. And so grains that are grown for hay, typically they harvest the top of the plant. And so the leaves and the seeds and the flowers are filled with nutrition for animals. And so hay is a food that has those plant parts in them that have nutrition for the animal. And so hay is more likely to have seed in it because it's the top of the plant that's being harvested. After they harvest the top of the plant, that stalk underneath that has few leaves on it, the stem, that's what straw is. And so when you look at straw, you'll see that it's hollow. You can actually take a little bit of straw and use it as a straw. You can suck up water with it if you want because it's hollow. It's the stem of the plant. That's the primary difference, is that hay is the top of the plant and straw is the bottom of the plant, which is why straw tends to have fewer seeds. However, depending on what the grain is and how they harvest it and how they bale it, you can have a lot of seeds in straw. And this last year, I had a terrible infestation of straw seedlings because whatever the plant was that straw was made from, obviously there were a lot of seeds that were left behind when they baled up the straw. So you can get seeds in your straw bales. It's less likely than the hay, but it can still happen. Now, as to what's being sold for Halloween decorations, typically those are straw bales. They should be able to be used. However, I have read that some of the straw that's being sold in stores like that is sprayed with something to keep it from rotting because it's going to be stored in a warehouse. Often sprayed with something like a shellac so that it holds together so that it can be displayed. So there might be something that's been sprayed on those bales, and who knows what it is, and who knows whether it would be harmful for your plants or not. So if you do use those bales that are being sold specifically as decorations, like most things in our garden that we're unsure of, I would say stick it outside in the weather, let it get rained on, let the sun bake it, let the snow fall, and give it as much time as you can for all of that stuff that might have been sprayed to break down in the UV rays and to leach out of those straw bales. And then it might be okay to use. But it can't be definitive because who knows just exactly how they've been treated. And that's really the biggest issue I would have about that. Okay, let's see what else we have. Brenda's asking, how much fertilizer can you put on your collards and broccoli? So this gets back to the same issue. If you have a good soil, you don't need any fertilizer. And I grew broccoli this year that did very well. And I showed it in the one video where I was letting it go to seed. And I didn't use any fertilizer in that bed at all. Now, if you use fertilizer on collards and broccoli, you're going to want to use a nitrogen fertilizer because with the collards, you want the greens, and with the broccoli, you actually want the greens as well, but you have to be careful because that broccoli head that we're eating is actually the flower head. And so while you want nitrogen to get the initial growth of the green plant, it's really the phosphorus that's going to be starting the development of those seed heads. So if you have a high nitrogen fertilizer on your broccoli, you might not get much in the way of actual broccoli to harvest. So again, I would say focus on the soil, put a lot of organic matter in the soil, get your soil nice and healthy, and you won't need any fertilizer at all. But if you do, use a nitrogen fertilizer on the collards and use a balanced fertilizer like a 10-10-10 on the broccoli. And as to how much, that's a good question. Read the directions on the label. The bags of fertilizer will tell you what the distribution is. Most often they'll say, like for a slow release, 1 pound per 100 square feet or whatever it happens to be, or 1 cup per 40 square feet. That's often how it's said, or it's labeled on a slow release. Or it'll say 1 ounce per 1 quart of water, or 1 tablespoon per gallon of water if it's going to be one of those water soluble ones. So that'll tell you how to make it and how much to use. And there should be recommendations on the bag based on the application and the plants that you're focusing on. So kind of like that I mentioned before, the time of year, like early in the cycle of the plant and mid-season is when, and then look at the bag, because it's different. If you've got a 4-2-1 fertilizer, there are fewer active ingredients in that than a 10-10-10. 10-10-10 by volume has more of the nutrients than a 4-2-1 fertilizer. So a lot of it depends on how quick you want to boost and how much fertilization you need. You might not need much at all, which is why you might want to go with a really low number, slow release kind of fertilizer. But definitely read the bags, because that will give you a lot of information, and you don't have to guess as much as you think you do. Hi Carol, my squash is fruiting but would not stay on the vine. I got one squash but all the fruits are dropping off. What could I try doing? It gets water and fertilizer. It could be fertilizer. Too much fertilizer can cause blossom drop and fruit drop, believe it or not. Gets back to that nitrogen component. If the plant's getting too much nitrogen, it's going to sacrifice flowers and fruit to grow. And so too much fertilizer can actually be detrimental to your plants. Focus on the soil and cut back on the fertilizer, and that may be one way to get new flowers to pop up and grow. Could also be a heat issue. If you had really hot conditions, that's enough to cause blossom drop and young fruit drop. Those are probably the two most likely reasons. And so that's where I would start. And again, a good healthy soil that stays evenly moist can help you get through some of those really hot days. And it's that organic matter in the soil that acts as little sponges to help keep the soil cooler on really hot days. And that might be something that could help you out. So soil. Soil is the key to a successful garden. It really is. And the artificial aids that we give our plants, like fertilizers, really bypass the importance of soil. So soil. Okay, let's see what else we have popping up. Llama, nice to see you back. One of my walking onion bulbs died soon after sprouting. All the other plants around them are healthy. Any ideas? It's unusual that just that plant died. So it's possible that you have a nematode or one of those onion borers that could be affecting your bulbs. Typically doesn't happen that soon after sprouting. And typically there aren't a lot of pests that are eating the onion leaves, but so that might be one of the issues. It could be a watering issue, over or under. That's often the case. But it's hard to figure out what that might have been. It might have just been a bad batch of bulbs. I hate to say it. Sometimes bulbs should have all the energy they need to grow the plant, but if they got too dry or if they're too old, they have given all of their energy for that initial sprout, and then they just don't have enough energy to keep the growth going. And unless some good roots have developed, then the plant could die. So it could just be that the bulbs themselves were faded to the point that they couldn't support a new plant. So sorry I couldn't be more definitive, but there's some ideas at least. Cal 1699, hello again to you as well. I grow squash in compost amended clay. I water daily and I can't keep up with the harvest. Good for you. I have a midsummer break in production as my first run overgrows, then an early fall and second run. That's awesome. And that's a good point. I actually did some reading this week about, anyway, compost is great in any soil. It improves both clay and sand. But I saw a little bit of research that was actually showing that a compost and clay mix is almost, I won't quite say ideal. Let's say it's very good for many of the plants we're growing, because the clay is really good at retaining soil moisture. And so in areas where you can keep your soil moist, the plants tend to do better. Compost in a sandy soil also does great, but that type of soil tends to drain faster, which means it requires more watering and more work. And so I'm not surprised that a compost amended clay is giving you a good harvest, because based on some stuff I've read in the past, but also some of that new stuff I read, we often think of clay soil as being bad, because it is hard to grow in clay soil. And if you're growing in clay soil, you can add all the fertilizer you want, and you're probably still going to have difficulty. But that compost, that organic matter in the clay soil, it helps break apart those clay particles and really improve the tilth of the soil, can really make a big difference. So you can grow well, as Cal is saying, in a clay soil. You just got to make sure that you're putting the amendments in, and composting is a great way to do it. Jamie McBrady's wondering, should I be composting in the fall? Absolutely. Anytime you've got organic matter that you can compost, I say compost. Now, whether you do a hot pile or a cold pile is totally up to you. But for me, in my garden, so like if this is my new garden area, and you notice that my neighbor has trees. I have no trees yet in my garden. I've planted fruit trees, but they're not growing well enough. So my only organic matter that I am able to compost from my yard are the plants I'm growing in spring and summer, and then cutting down in fall to put into my compost. So my compost gets a big boost in the fall, because that's when I have the most material to put into compost piles. So absolutely. Now, as the temperatures get colder in winter, you're going to have slower decomposition. The compost is going to slow down. My piles actually freeze in the winter, but then they start right back up again in the spring. And all of that stuff I threw in the fall is available for those microbes to start chomping on first thing in the spring as everything starts warming up. So yeah, absolutely. I say compost. You may not get finished compost before winter sets in, but at least you've got the pile there ready to go as soon as the weather warms again, and it can be ready to use in your garden come springtime. So definitely go for it. Yeah, Jen, I completely agree with you. Beg, borrow, and steal leaves for compost. And I'm still doing, you can almost see it right here. You can see the black. And so I did that video a year ago where I'm making leaf mold in that bin that I built. And I put dozens and dozens and dozens of bags of leaves to make leaf mold, which is basically just composted leaves. It takes a long time when you do just leaves. In your compost pile, definitely add some leaves as a component. That brings in some of the fungal activity. The fungus is typically what's breaking down the cellulose in the leaves, and the bacteria is breaking down the organic matter in the rest of the plants that we're putting in the garden. So you can get a really nice, rich, balanced compost when you put some leaves in there as well. So yeah, beg, borrow, and steal. That's definitely a way to do it. And I've done all of that when it comes time to get my bagged leaves. I'm already on the hunt for leaves. And yeah, Mary's exactly right. They're brown materials. It's a carbon material in your compost. So if you have a lot of these green leaf of squashes that you're cutting down because they're fading before a freeze comes, mix them with some dried leaves, and it's a great thing for your compost pile. I still have dried leaves from last year for that purpose. Our leaves have not fallen yet, so we don't have dried leaves to rake up yet, but I've got bags of raked leaves from last year for that exact reason, as a brown component to mix with all this green for my compost pile. So and that's actually, an interesting idea. Don't think that you have to use everything right away. I've got pine needles and straw, and I've got the leaves in bags that are there to be used when I'm ready to use them. And I might not be ready to use them for months down the road, but they're ready to go, and I have them in my garden when the time comes. and that's definitely something that you want to do. Llama just did the no as my husband almost threw away the banana peel. That's great. And so, yeah, for those of us that do like composting, I had that issue this week where I was making some videos and with some peppers and tomatoes and had some of that material to put in the compost pile. And I'd already taken my compost bag and dumped it on the compost pile. And so I didn't have my normal compost bag on the sink. And I came so close to just taking all of those cuttings that I had to throw in the trash. And I almost slapped myself in the face saying, "What are you doing? Just get out another bag and start a new compost bag. Don't throw this stuff away." So you're exactly right. You get into that mode where you just have to save everything organic to throw in the compost pile. So good for you. Good for you. That's definitely something to do. Coastal Gardens Northwest uses pine needles around blueberry plants. Yeah, and I use pine needles around my strawberries. I think pine needles are great around berry plants. So I've got pine needles around my strawberries. I got pine needles around my raspberries. That's a big use for pine needles that in my garden. I also use them in pathways between the beds. I think pine needles are great. And it's been a while since I've said this, but pine needles do not change the pH of your soil. It's a myth that if you put pine needles on the ground as a mulch, that it's going to acidify your soil. That just doesn't happen. Green needles on a tree are acidic, but once they turn brown and fall to the ground, they're pretty close to neutral. So you can use all the pine needles you want as a mulch around blueberries and anything else. And so I'm guessing you might have them around blueberries because that's very common because of that assumption that they acidify the soil, but it really doesn't acidify the soil. If you already have an acid soil, it's a great way to mulch, or like in my case with a more closer to alkaline soil, it's a great way to mulch. Love Always Jasmine is saying my garlic's already sprouting. Is that normal in zone 7? Yeah, it is normal in zone 7. I just put my garlic in zone 5. And I'll be looking for sprouting. You probably started, well, I would say almost definitely started your garlic too early. Zone 7 should probably be another month or so away from a typical starting garlic time. So it's normal if you start garlic early to see it sprouting, especially as the weather stays warmer. So keep an eye on it, keep it mulched, and then when your winter sets in, depending on how cold the winter is, the garlic sprouts can actually handle some pretty cold conditions. And so I have a video on growing garlic where I show the garlic in the snow. That the snow is not enough to kill the sprouts of garlic. It's when it gets really cold that you're going to see that problem. And zone 7 gets down to about 0 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about minus 18 Celsius. And you'll see some death of those garlic leaves if it gets that cold this winter for you. Should survive. The bulbs should still be okay. But like I said in my recent video, problems growing garlic or planting garlic is that if you do it too soon, you may not get a big bulb next year because that bulb or that clove used a lot of energy to send the plant up now. And then when that plant dies back and in the spring it starts growing again, well, you've already used some of that clove energy early and you might not get as big a plant next year. So keep an eye on it though. This is one of those kind of things to put in your garden journal and see how it happens. And next year, I would advise probably start your plants a little bit later, start your cloves later. And there's Riverdale saying upstate New York, garlic going in this week. And that's exactly my point. Zone 5, October is a good time to be putting in garlic. And zone 7 is typically between Halloween and Thanksgiving. So the beginning of November is a more typical time for zone 7 garlic. So just keep track of it. It's one of those things that, that's how you learn to do it better. Claudia, hello. My son gave me a compost bin for Christmas last year. It's like a barrel with two separate containers. Is that considered a hot composting or cold? So it depends. And so I had a system like that at my last house. And when you use a barrel like that, you can approach it from a couple different perspectives. You can either add material as it's available to one of the barrels and just build up the quantity over time. That's called composting because there just isn't enough volume, there isn't enough mass of material to get all of that thermophilic bacteria that makes a hot pile growing. They need a lot of material to build up that heat. And in those barrel compost systems, you just don't have that much material if you just add a little at a time. So it is cold composting. It'll still compost, it just takes a long time. If you can do hot compost in a barrel system, but you have to fill that barrel with all of the material, all the greens and browns, pack it full right away, then turn it to aerate it, and that's how you get hot system working in a barrel compost. So your choice. Either take it slow and it's cold, or you do it all at once and keep it turned on a regular basis and keep it moist, and then it becomes a hot pile, and you can have compost fairly quickly in a barrel system. So take your pick. And especially with two, you can do one of each. Pack one of those barrels and turn it every other day or so, and that'll be a hot system. And then take all your kitchen scraps and any other waste you have on the other barrel and fill it as it gets filled, and it becomes a slow system. And at slow compost, when the barrel is finally filled, then you can turn it into a hot compost by just aerating it and keeping it nice and moist. So Jen says lunchtime because the garlic's making you hungry. That's good. I don't do a lot of garlic myself at lunchtime, but it does make me think about what I'm going to make for dinner. Hello, Pedro. Last summer I grew different kind of tomato plants too close, and they seem to hybridize. All the fruit looked the same at the end. Is this normal? So it's possible that they hybridized. It's not likely. I grow my tomato plants about 18 inches apart, and I grow different varieties side by side, and I don't have a problem with that. Tomato flowers are most likely to pollinate themselves. So unless you've got a ton of insect activity with a ton of bees, it's not likely. And so as far as is it normal, I would say it's not normal that they're hybridized because tomatoes tend to pollinate themselves. But yes, it could definitely happen. And so as far as the fruit looking the same at the end, it could be, depending on what the variety is that you were growing, it could be that it is perfectly normal, and it might have been just a slight variation in that particular plant. But all the fruit on a plant is going to look all the same, whether it was hybridized or not. And so you're not going to get fruit, and you're not going to get yellow fruit and red fruit and big fruit and small fruit all on the same plant. Just if it was hybridized, you can expect that all the flowers and all the fruit are going to be pretty identical. Whether the plant is a hybrid or not is the other part of the question. So normal or not, I would say keep growing a lot of tomatoes, and you may see that this was just an anomaly. And I really wouldn't be too concerned about it unless you really wanted to save those seeds, and then you might have to try again next year and separate out that plant from the rest so that you don't have the same issue. Coastal Gardens is saying, I'm trying planting garlic in the ground and in containers to see which is best for my area. Yeah, great plan. I actually have not grown garlic in containers. I have such good success in my beds. This is one of those things that I haven't expanded to containers yet. But I know gardeners that actually do well growing garlic in containers. So good for you. Try them both and see which you like and see which does best. I think that's a great thing to try. Okay. Oh, it's so nice to see the conversations going back and forth and all the activity. It's always so wonderful. Um, Highlands Community Club saying, I have a compost bin, and if I fill it, I don't have the strength to turn it. Unfortunately, I just make small quantities in it. And that's one of those issues. I don't have a bin system like that. I just have my pallets in the background that I turn when I get around to it, and if it's too much work, then you end up not doing it. And so don't feel bad. I did that video a few months ago where I talked about slow composting. I call it lazy composting. And a lot of that is because it's just too much work and too much labor. Sometimes it can be too difficult to make compost the hot way. And the result is, yes, you do get less compost, and it does take longer for it to decompose, but it's still very beneficial for the garden. In fact, some of the research I've shown actually shows that the slow composting has more nutrients available than the hot composting, because a hot pile, because of that heat buildup, some of those nutrients, like the nitrogen, for instance, burn off and go out into the air. Whereas in a cool pile or a lazy compost pile, that heat never develops. So that nitrogen and a lot of those other nutrients that might be turned to gas and escape if they get too hot are still in the compost. So another reason why I tend to do a cool composting system is because that compost tends to have more nutrients than a hot pile. And so don't feel bad if you're not doing hot compost. There's actually nothing wrong with that at all. Hello, Luz. I put a large piece of cardboard on top of my carrot seeds to retain moisture, but it's been 4 weeks and they're not growing. I think I smothered them. What do I do differently next time? So don't give up yet, because carrots can take a very long time to germinate. And I've had carrots that took 4 weeks to germinate. So I would say take off the cardboard. First off, you probably run the possibility of smothering with cardboard. So if you do cardboard, just put it on for a week to keep the soil moist, to get that initial germination, and then take them off. Try using something like a burlap bag. Burlap can do the same thing, help hold in that moisture, but it also lets the air in, lets in a little bit light, and you can see when the carrots start sprouting. So I would say don't keep cardboard on as long next time, but the concept is definitely valid, where you can cover the seeds to help keep that moisture in, but you don't need it for a long period. It's just that initial phase of germination where you don't want the seeds drying out. So don't know if you can hear Mala barking in the background, but obviously there's something going on outside that's keeping her excited. So she doesn't normally bark. I wonder what's going on out there. Okay, let's see what else we have popping up here. Always nice to talk all of this gardening fun and activities. One other thing I did want to talk about fertilizers. We talked a little bit about the Comfrey tea and how you can take the Comfrey leaves and make a tea. Basically, you're just taking those nutrients from the leaves and putting it into the water. You can do that with a number of ingredients. You can make a tea. We talked about the leachate from the castings. You can actually take worm castings and put them in water and make a worm tea, where all the nutrients that were in the castings are now in the water. You can do weeds. All those weeds that you're pulling in your garden, you can put them in a bucket, cover them with water, and do the same thing. As those weed leaves and stems break down, all the nutrients that were in those plants now leach out into the water. So you can make all kinds of fertilizers. This year I grew stinging nettle for the purpose of making a tea. I didn't do the experiments that I had intended to do, so maybe you'll have to wait till next year to see that. But stinging nettles are a great plant that is packed with nutrients that you can make a tea fertilizer with those leaves. So you can learn much more about those kind of fertilizers. Again, it's not needed if your soil is healthy. What you can do is take those same ingredients and use them in your compost pile or as a mulch, and you get those same nutrients. The leaching and the making of tea is just kind of a quick way to get some of that material into the soil. But when you make a tea like that, it's not like a Miracle Grow water-soluble fertilizer. It is those nutrients and those organic particles in that tea that you're adding to your soil. You still need the soil microbes to turn all of those into usable forms for the plants to use. And so that's one of those things that I've had people ask. They use a worm tea or a compost tea or a comfrey tea or a stinging nettle tea, and they don't see that immediate effect on their plants. They think it's going to be like Miracle Grow where the plant's going to immediately perk up. Well, it doesn't work that way because those ingredients in those teas have to be broken down by the soil microbes before all of that, those nutrients and the organic matter within that water can be used. So just be aware of that. They're kind of in the middle. They're not a slow release fertilizer, but they're not a quick action fertilizer either. But it's definitely an option to feed the soil and to give the soil some of that extra boost that the plants can use. Okay, there's Cal again. It's my first year growing garlic. I certainly know the variety. I got Music, Spanish Roja, Inchlium Red. I've grown all of those. I think those are all good choices. I love the Music. I actually, this year I am not growing Spanish Roja, but I am doing the Music and Inchlium Red and everything else. So good for you. I suspect you'll enjoy all of those garlics. I think they are definitely ones that we should all consider doing. Riverdale says, my compost typically takes a year. Gather all the materials winter, spring, summer, and then in fall layer it with leaves and cover with a tarp. Pumpkins grow in it the following spring and add to beds next fall. Awesome. That's a great way to do it. And that's exactly what I was talking about, doing the slow, nice, easy method. Lots of nutrients. That's a great way to do it. Coastal Gardens is making nettle tea as well to use the dirty water from fish tanks and filters to feed flowering plants. And fish tanks, that's another great, so if you use the water from fish tanks, same basic idea. It's basically fish manure, and just like we would be adding other manures to our garden, can give a great boost to the soil, and then that gives the boost to the plant. But by themselves, the plants aren't using or feeding upon that material. It's the fact that you're putting all that in the soil, which is just another way of adding organic matter to the soil. And so that's why when I make these teas, I don't think of them as fertilizers, because we tend to think of fertilizer as a food for a plant. And the true fertilizers that the farmers are using that really are plant food because the soil is barren, that's assumed to be the case with all fertilizers. But a lot of these things that we add to our garden, like the stinging nettles or like these teas, like the other organic matter, are really feeding the soil microbes. They're really not a true fertilizer, even though they are adding nutrients. And that is kind of the definition of a fertilizer, is adding the nutrients. But it's really adding the nutrients to the soil. And that's the big important factor I wanted to convey today, is the difference between feeding the soil and feeding the plant. If you feed the soil will feed the plant. And that's really what it comes down to. Okay, let's see. Sharon is saying hi from Whitby, Ontario. Just got my garlic from Vessie's in Prince Edward Island. Awesome. Has been a mild fall, so not in a rush to plant. And that's the mode I've been in. I'm actually about 2 weeks later this year with my garlic than normal, because it's been so hot, so warm. We've been regularly 10 to 15 degrees warmer than normal, and the soil temperature is still too warm. And I know we still have a lot of warm days ahead looking at the long range forecast. So I delayed my garlic this year as well. This is, again, I love the idea of pushing garden journals because I think there's just so much to learn when we look back. And this is an ideal subject for your garden journal is whether you're in zone 7 and you've already started your garlic, or you're in zone 5 and you're not starting till this week. You keep track of those kind of things and then see how well your plants do during the normal growing season. And you can get an idea of, like in the case of garlic, when the best time is to actually put the cloves in the ground to grow. So everybody's different. Every garden is unique. You just got to figure out what works best for you. And I'm finding that the calendar date that I've used in the past is shifting. It is shifting by a week or two each year. I think I've said this before. I'm in zone 5B. I think we're getting real close to moving into zone 6A just because of our historical cold temperatures in winter. Whenever they do another release and modify the zones, I suspect that's where we're headed, because in my garden journal, I've kept track of the low temperatures and we're just not there. The average low temperature for zone 5B is minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit, which is minus 26 Celsius. That's the definition of zone 5B. This last year, we had one day where we did get that cold, but it's been 5 or 6 years since we got that cold. And so they typically look at a 30-year average. And so I'm just looking at the years I've been keeping track of. And when they determine a new average lowest temperature, it's going to be warmer than minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit, which now means we move into a new zone. So you got to modify your garden as your climate changes. That's definitely something to think about. Yeah, Mage Graywolf says, I think I'm moving into zone 11 from zone 10A. And it's very possible. 7B at the Arizona Highland Homestead. It's just one of those things. Yeah, Mage says didn't get below 40. And so that happens, especially in the warmer zones, the 9, 10, and 11s. You might not see freezing conditions. And if you do, it's an anomaly. And so it doesn't affect the definition of the zone when the zones have changed. Llama, hello again to you. My neighbor brought over a bunch of frozen trout. Any ideas on how to incorporate them into soil without attracting critters and bears? So, yeah, and I talked about this a month or two ago where I had planted fish with my corn. And my dog at the time, Shaka, waited until the corn was actually growing to go out and dig up the fish. And that's definitely a possibility. If you bury fish and you have an issue with bears or any other animal, that like a dog that might want to dig up the fish, that's a concern. And so I would advise against burying it, just because my experience is they're going to dig it up and you're going to lose whatever the plants were. You can make your own fish emulsion. I'm not sure that I've seen a video. I'm sure there's videos out there, but it's like the Bass-O-Matic, that old Saturday Night Live skit from about 40 years ago, where you just take a fish and grind it up in a blender. And that's basically what fish emulsion is if you buy a jug of fish emulsion. So you could make your own fertilizer. Grind up the fish, mix it with some water, and add it to your compost, add it to your soil. It's definitely an organic matter that is suitable to use. Just be aware, as with any other meaty or fatty product, you're more likely to attract the critters. And so unless you have it in a fenced-in area that those critters can't get into, I'd probably say stay away from using it. It just invites too many potential problems when you have a food that especially a predator like a bear is going to be looking for. And we've got bears in our area that eat from the bird feeders because it's free food. And if you give them a fish in your compost pile or lightly buried in your garden, they're going to come back because obviously you've given them a great smorgasbord, and they're going to come back and check out what you're giving them next week. And that's one of those things you might want to avoid if you don't want a lot of bears in your garden. So asking, is it better to make a fish into a motion, or does that stay on the surface? Oh, there you go. So that's what I was just talking about. It's one of those things. Definitely experiment with it. That's why I did it. I buried it there, and there are videos out there from other channels that have buried fish, and they show the results. The fish has nutrients in it, and those nutrients will be used by the soil organisms and broken down into usable form for the plants, as we've been talking about. It's just a different source. The fish is a different source than compost, but the concepts are exactly the same. So yes, you can give a boost of nutrients to your soil by using a fish emulsion or a whole fish. It's going to take longer for the whole fish to break down than if you make a fish emulsion. But it's those pests, those things that get into our garden that we might not necessarily want in our garden, like raccoons. The raccoons will definitely come to get the fish. So be aware of that. It's one of those things that I would be careful about if you do it. And like last week or the week before, I mentioned some people I know that built a fully enclosed compost bin because they live in bear country. And so they had to have a chain link fence around all four sides and the top to keep the bears out of their compost. If you're willing to do that, then definitely go for it. Okay, let's see. Nick is saying, do you have the time? I have somewhere to be at 3 o'clock. Okay, that's funny. Actually, we are getting to that point where we are starting to think about other things, the philosophy point of the show that I like to talk about. It's still gardening based, but it's not so specific that we're talking about the plants or the fertilizers. Instead, it's the things that I ask you to think about as you move through your week. And this week, I want you to know that you're a superstar. I think gardeners, as a whole, we are all superstars. And so here's why I started thinking about this. So you may be aware of the PBS show in the United States, Grow a Greener World. Joe Lamp'l is the host. It's been on for a number of years. Joe Lamp'l also has a YouTube channel. Joe Gardener is what he goes under, and had a recent episode where he was, because he often goes to different gardens, and so he'd gone to the home of Craig LaHoulier. And so it's actually LaHoulier. I thought it was LaHoulier. Craig LaHoulier. And Craig is most famous as a gardener for the one who discovered and developed and then began sharing the Cherokee purple tomato, which is a famous tomato. Many of us have grown it. Well, it was Craig LaHoulier that really developed that. And then he wrote his tomato book, and it's a fantastic book on tomatoes. And so he's a bit of a gardening celebrity because he's written a book, I think he has a couple books on tomatoes primarily, and he's the originator of the Cherokee purple tomato. He's a gardener, just like you and me. He grows his tomatoes, he grows his garden in buckets and bags on his driveway. It's not some big fancy operation because he's this garden superstar. He's just a gardener who developed a tomato because he had an interest in it and got halfway famous in the gardening community as a result of it. Joe Lamp'l has his own PBS show. Just a gardener. If you see his Joe Gardener YouTube channel, it's at his house. He's doing the same things you and I are doing. And this is one of those things where gardening, I think, separates us from so many other arenas. If you have a Kobe Bryant or Alex Rodriguez or some big famous superstar athlete, a Tom Brady. They're the best at what they're doing, and they are superstars. And we see them as being somebody that has superhuman abilities in their particular arena. Well, when it comes to gardening, we all have those super abilities to reach that same success. The tomato I'm growing in my garden is nowhere near better or worse than the tomato you're growing in your garden. It might be the same variety, it's probably a different variety, but just because I've got a YouTube channel and I know a lot about gardening doesn't mean I'm a superstar. Doesn't mean that I'm doing it better than you. You are also the superstar. You're a celebrity in your own right. You might not have 240,000 subscribers on YouTube. You might not have a PBS show. You might not have a book that you've written, but you still get out and water the garden. You still weed. You still have to plan. You still harvest. You still do everything the same. And that's the point that I wanted to bring up this week, is that it doesn't matter how famous you are as a gardener, the activities you're doing are exactly the same as every other gardener in the world. We're the same. This week, I actually had a comment, and actually Charles Dowding had the same comment. So Charles Dowding has become famous because of the books that he's written on no-dig gardening. And there was a comment on Twitter that it's so nice that someone like Charles Dowding and I can talk to each other and converse and have different viewpoints about issues. And I liked the comment that Charles Dowding made to that, and Charles Dowding liked the comment that I made. We're just people. On Twitter, in this case, we both have YouTube channels. We garden differently because we live in different areas of the world, but we do things the same. We still are growing our plants, having the same problems, the same issues, the same concerns, and the same plans, and the same hopes, and the same goals. And so I just don't want you to feel bad or feel like you just don't know enough because you see the gardening superstars, the YouTube celebrities that are making the videos like I am. We're just regular people. We're just regular gardeners, and we may make it look easy, but it really isn't any easier than the process that you're going through. And so you are a superstar in your own right. Had a gardening club meeting this last weekend. I'm in our local gardening club, and some of the discussion at the gardening club opened my eyes. I learned some stuff from some of the other gardeners and some of the things they're doing locally, and that's what it's all about. I don't know everything. I learn something every single day about gardening. I just have that kind of memory that I can keep it locked up in this brain and then give it back to you at some point in the future if you ask the question. But all of these little tidbits of information, all these things that I share with you, I haven't always known them. It's things that I've learned along the way. And so there's nothing special about Gardener Scott. There's nothing about my celebrity that makes me a better gardener. It's just that I've been doing it longer, and I've been trying things out, and I learn from the many, many mistakes that I've made. Most of the time, I'll make the same mistake 2 or 3 times sometimes before it sets in and I fix it and do it right the 4th time. But that's what gardening is all about. And that's why you and I, all of us as gardeners, really are on the same playing field. I really can't think of a superstar gardener. Someone who is so far above everybody else that they stand in another league. They may have better success with a particular type of plant, like Craig LaHoulier, but when it comes to the other things, like some of my master gardener friends, they may be an expert in one area, but there's a whole bunch of areas they know very little about. And that's who we are. We just are regular people gardening, making mistakes, trying to avoid the frost that might be coming to save those plants that have become so dear through the gardening season. But the plants are going to die, happens to all of us, and that's just the way it is. So give yourself a pat on the back, give yourself a gold star, give yourself your own bonus check as a superstar. No one else is going to do it because I don't think there really is that hall of fame of gardeners that we look up to and go, wow, they did everything right. Because none of us do everything right. We have the same struggles. So you are a superstar because you are a gardener. And just by being in the battle means that you're doing better than all those other people who haven't even started to learn what it means to be a gardener. So kudos to you, pat on the back. I think it's great that you're here in this group of gardeners. Because it doesn't matter where you are a gardener, you're just like all the rest of us, and you are a superstar. There you have it. I think I'm a superstar. I think you're a superstar because we have plants like this that we grow in our allotment or our backyard or on our deck or in our basement. It doesn't matter where you grow. It's all the same issues where we want to grow something and we want that success as a result of it. So there you have it. You superstar, you. I hope to see you next Monday for another edition, same time, and we'll talk gardening. I hope it's a great gardening week ahead for you, and I need to get outside and see what gardening tasks I can get done for today. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.